And it's recording. Go.
Hello. Hello to everyone who's joined us this morning for our first ever, jazz hands, version of Synthesis, which is our webcast / podcast, whichever way you like it. It kind of came of an idea that we knew all these interesting and diverse people between Justin and I. And then we're also very interested about that diversity in our lives and in society and in the ideas that we come across in our work all the time. And we often get into these in-depth conversations that sort of exposes them and gets inside of these paradoxes and these contradictions, and it's rich. And so we thought, why not have this kind of conversation publicly where others can engage in it and find, hopefully, that in all of our dichotomies and contradictions is real humanity, because that's what we're really made up of. So Synthesis is a tribute to that, and it's a tribute to the very, very interesting, compelling people that we are very fortunate to know. If you don't know us, my name is Emily Sicorsi. Justin, say your name.
I'm Justin Foster. We comprise Root and River. Sometimes she's Root, sometimes I'm River, sometimes we flip it around. And then one of our good friends is a wonderful man named Frank Rogers, who is an entrepreneur and thought leader here in Austin, Texas. And he introduced us to Treion. And in our very first call with you, Treion, we had this chemistry. And we pointed out how hard that is to do just on the voice. I don't think it was on video. I think it was just a phone call. And it was just simple. There was a symphony to it, an alchemy to it. And that's coupled with what you said about how we know these cool people. Well, that spark that Treion, you should be our first guest, came out of that initial call that sometimes the most obvious things to do are the most simple things. And so your background, your personality, the way you see the world, you make the perfect guest for Synthesis, and even a more perfect guest to be the first one. So welcome.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
Yeah. And just a little bit more background on you. You're the Vice President of Digital Learning Solutions for 2080. You're originally from South Africa. And you've got a very diverse background: digital transformation, monetizing digital strategies, working with technology trends and really being on the cutting edge of that. And what interests you and what brought us together is this disparity between how we use digital in our professional lives and then also in our personal lives, and how that's very different. So that's kind of where we're going to be starting today and kind of talking about that. But wanted to give everyone a little intro to you.
Yeah, excited to talk about something that is a bit of a teaser, but this idea that the term consumer has changed. We think the same thing about branding. When people say brand, you have to recalibrate what you call that, because what you used to call brand isn't brand anymore. And what you used to call a consumer is no longer a consumer. The title of consumer has shifted. So excited to dig into that with you.
Definitely. So we're going to kind of go back in time a little bit for our opening question. And like I said, in the intro, we're really interested in paradoxes and diverse experiences. So you grew up in South Africa. What were some of the paradoxes or diverse concepts that you were exposed to as a child growing up?
Well, the obvious one, and the elephant in the room in South African history, is apartheid, right? Segregation. And I tell people I was fortunate to be poor, growing up poor with a single mother, because I got to grow up in a poor part of Johannesburg and mingle with people of all colors, and realize that they were no different than I was, despite what I was being taught in school or what the public sentiment was for people of color. And it was very confusing for me, because in school I'd hear one thing, and I'd go home and I'd play with my black friends, and I think they're just like me. Mm-hmm. And in some ways they're better than me. And that wasn't what I was hearing. So that was a huge paradox for me. I'm very grateful. I'm so grateful that I was poor during that time, because it facilitated that learning. That was the biggest paradox.
Yeah. Wow, and such a young age to sort of confront that and have that awareness of it, that was so in contradiction to everything that surrounded you. It's really cool. So what lesson did you learn early in your life, or maybe early in your career, that has sort of stuck with you today? Because I think sometimes we learn things really young, and they kind of become, and what we found in our work is that they become this talisman or a token that we continue to travel with. So curious for you.
Well, there's two things. And the first thing is be a constant learner. And I really enjoy, I wrote a white paper a few years ago called The Mutant Learning Lab, and how we all can take advantage of the influx of social media and channel that information or channel information that's coming to us to our benefit, to help us in certain ways. And so I try to do that every day. At least 15 to 30 minutes I spend on research and writing, because it improves me. It makes me a better man. And there's always things that we can learn.
Mm-hmm.
That's number one. And number two is failure is essential. And I think that failure is a misnomer. It's a wrong term. I think it actually goes hand in hand with my first talisman or first rule I live by, which is learning. Because don't be afraid to try something that you've never done before. Don't be afraid. Because you haven't been there doesn't mean it doesn't exist. And I've learned this, that I learned so much from going out and trying something and then failing. And again, I don't think it's the right term. Learning from that, it becomes a reservoir of knowledge. That experience that you can draw upon. Now, where you fail in the true sense of it is where you make the same mistake again. Okay, that's failure, and even then you can get up from it and improve. But I love the fact that we have to change our minds. We're all about comfort, right? Even our bodies seek homeostasis, a comfortable level of operation. Our entire being is about being comfortable. The problem with comfort when it comes to our growth up here and in our hearts is that it requires us to be vulnerable, to try new things, to reach out and meet new people and do different activities. And sometimes we will learn from that in a way that we stumble and fall a little, but we're stronger because of it. So those are the two things I really believe and live by.
Very interesting.
But was there ever a moment where you kind of lost the thread of one of those and had to refine it?
Absolutely, especially learning. We get busy, caught up in the busyness of our day to day, and we get blinded by what we think what we think are important tasks. And I love the Habit 7 from Stephen Covey's book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. Habit 7 is sharpen the saw. And the principle is you can keep hacking away at trees, but eventually that saw blade is going to become dull. We have to then take a moment to sharpen that saw. And there are times in my life when I've been so busy chopping away at trees without taking a moment to stop and recalibrate and process and reassess and then sharpen that saw. And we all should practice that. A lot of the greatest leaders that we can think of, think of Bill Gates, think of, several people that I've studied recently, they take moments for reflection. Some of them called mindfulness, meditation. Some people just sit and process. Some people take power naps. But those things are essential for our functioning effectively. And I've lost that sometimes. I have to then recalibrate and make sure I get on track again.
I think it's interesting, Treion, what you said about both of those things is, Emily, you have to correct me if I'm saying this word wrong, but autodidact, or an autodidactic learner is someone that learns through failure and experiences. And so historians point out that almost all great innovations do not come from the learned per se in the traditional sense of learned. Da Vinci had no training in what he did. The Wright brothers built bicycles before they tried to build an airplane. Henry Ford had no particular background or training in assembly line production of mass marketed cars. And so I think we're almost returning, Emily and I use this term a lot, it's not so much old versus new anymore, it's old versus ancient. So there's this old period of industrial age thinking, and we're returning to some ancient principles like lifelong learning, as opposed to learning for a promotion, learning because your soul hungers to learn new things.
Or learning for an assembly line.
Yeah, exactly. Learning for some sort of production, exactly.
I love that. And Kaizen, that's a Japanese term for continuous improvement. So you're right, that's an ancient philosophy for learning and continuous improvement. I love that.
Exactly.
So, Treion, you recently put together a white paper that you were kind enough to share with us and called The Consumer, Not Content is King. So I want to kind of dive into that a little bit. And I see it definitely related it's to learning. But in there you talk about how consumers consume everyday information, right? Like my daughter wants a certain kind of braid in her hair. So I go to YouTube and I learn how to do the braid and then I do the braid. And then we switch over into our professional lives. And we need to, you know, earn this certification, or somebody says you got to take this course or whatever. And it's like this whole other experience.
Yes.
And so maybe you can just share, you know, why we have this divide, and why do you think that that exists?
So yeah, that talking about paradoxes. So actually, what I shared with you has evolved into an ebook that should come out this week or next week, called The Power of the Consumer on Learning and Development, or L&D. Mm-hmm. And in it, there are 7 consumer realities that can no longer be ignored. Mm-hmm. So the paradox and the reason why we act differently, and this is something, I mean, I've worked in some of the largest training companies in the world. I've been on the outside looking in on others. I've researched and kept up to date on what is happening in the learning and development industry, right? Mm-hmm. I go to conferences, I speak at conferences, I attend the expos to see what people are developing to help with learning and development. And I'm seeing, it's an interesting conundrum we find ourselves in. Because on one hand, just over the last 10 years, we've been conditioned as consumers of information, as well as consumers of services and products, but also of information, to expect that information to be at the ready. For example, you had a question about braiding, you Google it, or you go directly to YouTube and you search for that, mm-hmm. and you find it and you consume it, and then you apply it. Mm-hmm. Now, the basis for all learning and development, or training and development, is behavior change, right? So what happened was there was a behavior change. You know now how to braid after watching a 3-minute video. You didn't have that information before. So it was just in time information that you sought, mm-hmm. that you consumed, and that you applied. Mm-hmm. Now, in traditional learning and development, and most companies around the world, what happens is I have a question about performance management. That's just an example. Or about delegation, or about a troublesome employee. And so what do I do? What options do I have? Most of the time, there is not a just-in-time way for me to go to a source of information, like a Google, type in that question. I have a problem with an employee that does this. Be very specific. Mm-hmm. You can't do that. And so what you end up having to do is sign up for a training course that is a month away, that is usually 1 or 2 or 3 days, maybe even a week of immersive experience. So you go to that when all you wanted was an answer to a specific question and a problem you were having, a pain point right now. So you see the disparity, or the paradox, where in our consumer lives, we can get information instantaneously. Now, it's not always quality. Let me just be clear on that. And there's hundreds and thousands sometimes of things we have to sift through, or sources we have to sift through to get that information. Whereas training and development over the years has become a quality product. It's taken years of finesse to create a learning experience that helps people change behavior. But this is where the change happens. We're used to getting information specifically on something we want right now with our consumer lives, our personal lives. Mm-hmm. We go to work, and when we have a specific question or pain point, we have to wait, or we have to go to a webinar where there's mind-numbing PowerPoints and death by one person speaking the whole time, or we click through a self-paced experience that may be an hour long, and it's just really boring, and maybe in the middle there's somewhere an answer, but it's nothing specific. So there is this disparity going on. It's fairly new because of the digital revolution and literally the innovation that's happened in the last 5 to 10 years. Mm-hmm. It's only been that long. Mm-hmm. So hopefully that gives you some idea of my thinking with this ebook.
Yeah, I think that's fascinating. It's a fascinating take. It's one of those things that as soon as you started talking about them, like, yeah, I can totally get that, where you're coming from, where it's, again, simple thing, obvious thing, right out in the open, we don't notice it, but your mind noticed it. And it matches up something that Emily and I talk about a lot in when we give presentations, workshops, do our root sessions, whatnot, is the marketplace does not need more information. What they need is more context, but they need rapid context because our brains are tired. And I think what you're talking about is in the workplace is delivering what people actually need from a contextual standpoint, not from an information standpoint.
Yes.
Would that be accurate?
Information dump doesn't help anyone.
Right.
And unfortunately, Google, while it does a lot of great things, that's what it doesn't do very well for us.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, I think another follow-up question to that, too, is that we have seen this, and especially, Emily, your background in behavioral science and mine with working with some various leadership development firms, is that there tends to be still a lot more remedial coaching than actually developing the whole person. So for example, someone says, well, this person doesn't get along with others and they need some conflict resolution or how to be less of a jerk or a training program. And then, like you said, it's remedial, though. It's not actually encouraging them to go inward and self-examination, emotional intelligence, and those things. And that seems like an inherent flaw in most L&D content, is that it is remedial as opposed to edifying. Would you agree, disagree, of commentary on that?
So if you were to talk to any training development company that develops IP, especially soft skills, they would say you are incorrect. And this is why. The instructional design for a typical instructor-led training or in-person training does often include introspection, relevance, and application in that experience. Where there's a disconnect, and I think what you're referring to is it's outside of our natural habitat. Mm-hmm. It's in a training room. Mm-hmm. It doesn't facilitate or allow a lot of real life or real work application. It encourages it. It doesn't facilitate it. Mm-hmm. But blended learning alternatives that a lot of companies are doing are helping with that. And let me be clear. I'm not saying immersive instructor-led training is a bad thing. I'm thinking it's fantastic. It depends on what you want to accomplish. Mm-hmm. I think we were talking specifically about how to access information in the moment I need it. And Google refers to this as the micro moments. Mm-hmm. They have a great initiative on micro moments, mm-hmm. which is people in the I want to know or I want to do moment. What do they do? And they have data, of course, because they Google, showing people searching for, I want to do a braid, mm-hmm. Special braid. And so that's what we're referring to. Don't get me wrong. In some instances, immersive 1-2 day, even a week training is necessary and even edifying because it allows people to truly be immersed in that experience and then come away. Now, this is where there's a disconnect and always has been a disconnect, is we fire hose people with information. Often they love the experience. They call it a paradigm-changing experience. Mm-hmm. The secret sauce was there. It was head and heart. It was wonderful. Most training then provides them with an accountability guide or an action guide or something to say, over the next 7 weeks, go do these following things every week. What do we all do when we get back to work? We take that manual, despite all our good intentions, and we put it up on a shelf. Mm-hmm. That is the reality. However, technology and blended learning has helped change the face of that. So we can hold people more accountable. We can say, oh, in a week, we can have a webinar like this. And all we're going to do is you guys can report on what you did on week 1 based on what you learned. Now, that's a good model. That's a great model. That's not what I'm talking about in my ebook. I'm talking about more in those moments when we want an answer now to a specific question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, interesting.
In the ebook, you present these like reality checks which you mentioned, 6 of them, and I found them.
Sorry,
really, that's okay. They found them great. Just kind of what I'm most interested in is that you mentioned too that these programs are created from a bygone era, right? But we're still holding to them, right? We're holding to this in-person immersive experience, and then here's your workbook, see you later. So there are people behind that are holding to that, and there are institutions that are really holding to that. And yet these realities, these 6 realities, this kind of shock treatment of facts, as you've said in the past, exist. They're real. So, I mean, why do we continue to hold on to them? And do you see hope for, I mean, we see when we talk to people in these spaces, there's this acknowledgement that things are changing, but a reticence to fully embrace them and sort of a going through the motions of embracing them, and not a deep kind of excitement or leaning in kind of a attitude towards them. So, I mean, I'm really interested in talk a little bit about why we're holding on to those, and then, maybe share some of the reality checks that you see.
So it's interesting, and that's why I say your learner is also your consumer, is also a consumer, right? Mm-hmm. So in one way, they've been conditioned to get information instantaneously, and in another way, and this is why people are holding on, Emily, is for hundreds of years, we have adhered to and practiced a Socratic method or a lecture method of information sharing. It's been part of our higher education, it's part of our high school, in all our education for hundreds of years. Mm-hmm. We have been conditioned as a society, as a culture, to believe that there's a sage on the stage, there's one person we go to as an expert. We have institutions that push that. People are tenured, people are required to write papers. It becomes this, it's institutionalized is what I'm saying. Yeah. And so it's hard to let go of those practices. Even though we've known, for example, one study that I always go back to because I love what George Miller from Princeton in 1956 taught us about information process theory. Mm-hmm. And his studies, by the way, have been replicated over and over dozens of times, showing the same thing, which is in 1956, this is before the digital revolution, in all the studies he conducted, he determined that no matter how charming the presenter, the facilitator, no matter how interesting the content, that learners could not focus their attention for longer than 20 minutes at a time. Mm-hmm. The brain wouldn't allow that. It just needed a lull. It needed a time to prepare, to process. We've known that since 1956, but when I went to college, and I'm not going to say when I went to college, but when I went to college, it was still an hour lecture.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So to me, that's saying we haven't been listening.
Yeah.
We haven't really been taking note for what's been changing. And by the way, that's changed. A new study by ATD says that attention span, because I think of the conditioning with digital, is now down to 10 minutes or less. Mm-hmm. And there's more studies about video should be less than 1 to 2 minutes if you really want to capture their attention. Mm-hmm. So that's been changed because of conditioning, but we've known it for a while, and yet we hold on to what we know and what we're comfortable with.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah. The branding parallel here is that Jack Trout and Al Reese wrote Positioning, Battle for the Mind in the early 70s. And they talked about market saturation and intense competition. This was prior to cable, prior to the internet, prior to mobile. And yet there's still a lot of those similar metrics or mindset. And one of the things we like to point out, and I assume it's probably true in learning, is you can't do all the marketing. It's impossible. You can't do all the marketing. So you have to pick and choose, which means you need to have a strategy, which means you have to be a strategic thinker and not a linear tactical thinker. And so the parallels, again, and part of the reason we wanted to visit with you are the parallels between learning, because modern branding is teaching a belief system. And when you do it right, modern branding is teaching a belief system to an audience, so that you find people that believe what you believe, or you convert people to believe what you believe. And so that it has to have a learning aspect to it. So we see those parallels.
Absolutely.
I think it's interesting that we've continued to hold on to them, though. There's a little bit of hubris and a lot of attachment in the face of other institutions that have adjusted, that created new formats. And, I mean, the lady I learned how to braid the hair, she's just, she lives somewhere. I don't even know where she lives. She's probably about like 16 years old. She's got 2 million followers and can monetize what she's doing in a heartbeat, as many other big big learning outlets, so to speak, like Udemy or Khan Academy have done. So it definitely is an interesting paradox in time when there's this sense of like, no, if you're going to learn something for work or for that, it has to be more of this way. and this attachment to that style and method, when the rest of the market is screaming out for something very different.
One more thing I want to add is what makes it hard, why we're still holding on, as in the training and development or learning development industry, why it's so hard to make this jump is because that's where our business models are.
Yeah.
Right. Yes.
Operational setup, that's how we set up to function. Marketing, and we worked on that for years in advertising, and then it comes to the product development. Well, this is how we've always done it. This is how learning should be conducted because this is how we learn to do it.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's very hard. And that's why I say in my ebook, I'm not saying we can do this overnight. Mm-hmm. I'm not even saying that we should do all of it. I'm just saying we should be aware of how our learners, who are also consumers, are being conditioned differently. And we need to consider what can we do within our institutions, our corporations, our companies, to maybe move in that direction. And strategically, I would work on a roadmap. I would work on short, long-term goals. And by the way, this is not, if you look at the Crossing the Chasm book, this is not early adopters. We're past early adopter stage. We've crossed the chasm. Okay? Especially in other industries. We've crossed the chasm on how we can go with digital, for example, to facilitate just-in-time learning. Mm-hmm. But we're still hesitant because our business models are set up a certain way. We're used to selling a certain way. Our salespeople are positioning it a certain way. We package things in neat packages that say it's a day long. Mm-hmm. It's a half-day webinar or whatever. We package it a certain way so our salespeople can sell it. So I'm saying this is a tough challenge, and each company has to think of it differently and consider what their roadmap should be, but they have to be aware that this is happening to them. I mean, if we're honest with ourselves, we all are consumers that have these same consumer realities.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And do you see, talk a little bit about the other side of it? Like innovation cannot be limited to a certain provider, a certain segment. I think I hear you saying it's got to be something that every institution that is responsible in some way for training or developing people needs to be thinking about and creating in their own, right? So you talked about a roadmap, but what else do you see like down the road? What do you see as possible? What do you imagine?
There's some cool things happening. And so let me be clear. I think I'm not a believer that we should, especially when it comes to technical products, that we should bring things in-house unless we really have a team already. Mm-hmm. Nowadays, technology and digital innovation has caught up with the idea, mm-hmm. and there are products out there, hundreds of them, that can meet our specific needs. We need to just partner with them, mm-hmm. right? The right partners, doing the right things for us, so that we don't have to reinvent the wheel, which has been worked on for the last 10 years, right? Mm-hmm. I think what the future holds for us, and I went to a conference just recently where this was spoken of, and I completely agree, is look around at how we use artificial intelligence. And I'm talking about bots. I'm talking about voice commands. And I have a Google Home, and a lot of people have Alexa, and it's amazing how that and the Internet of Things, how everything in our homes are becoming very natural. If I have a question, I go, hey, Google, what's the weather today?
Right.
And she tells me.
Mm-hmm.
And that's advancing to a great degree because it's helping. So it's making us as consumers, our lives easier. But think of it, it's also teaching. It's a learning mm-hmm. platform now. It's no longer just information. It's a learning platform for me. I can say, hey, Google, what is ferrofluid? And it'll give me the definition based on Wikipedia or wherever. So we have to be aware that voice commands and I love the fact that we have smart computing or bots that can go out and get information for us all the time naturally and then present it up for us in a very customized fashion. And this is nothing new. Amazon does this, right? Mm-hmm. We buy something and it what then dictates what ads we get in our Facebook stream, in our Instagram stream. These bots are out there working for us. They're creating all this information that now just has to be channeled to specific learning needs. Mm-hmm. And so artificial intelligence, which everything I've spoken about falls under that category, is already happening. It's just a matter of how will it apply to learning and development.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a lot of opportunities for vendors and innovators out there.
Mm-hmm.
I think you look at it from an outside-in standpoint. Even the work we do in branding is very intrinsic, but it's so that you can be extrinsic and create a reputation, revenue, et cetera, et cetera. The market, the consumer, the traditional consumer, the buyer, has access to the same information as the seller and the people supporting the seller now, and they are learning in these new ways. The consumer, the buyer, has already learned how to get instant results and customization because businesses have trained them, as you said, Amazon and others have trained them this, and yet there still remains this gap between how you train the people that are supposed to support the customer, support the buyer, where they're not following the same principle. And so I guess with that statement, the question behind this is, what are 2 or 3 executive biases that prevent a organization from adopting the type of L&D that you're learning and development that you're talking about?
Well, again, we all revert to what we know.
Mm-hmm.
It's part of human nature. We go with what we're comfortable with, what's brought us success before, what's made us money before. And so the biggest biases we have are our own past experiences. Mm-hmm. It's also, it's in those instances we have to educate, right? Those executives that are making those decisions to the possibility and what else is out there. There's a lot of talk about disruption. A lot of examples about disruption. A great book on that is Digital at Scale, which talks about, it gives lots of examples, but one of them is how Netflix disrupted Blockbuster. Blockbuster had the leg up on the market. It had the opportunity, but it was disrupted because Blockbuster wasn't willing to look outside of what it knew, what its business model that had brought them there, wasn't going to take them into the future. So the biggest biases are just being comfortable with what we know and what has been successful before. I don't believe, by the way, that you have to switch everything over. Mm-hmm. I think you can start with or continue doing what you're doing, right? Then work on a specific strategic roadmap where you disrupt from within. Otherwise, you'll be disrupted from without. Mm-hmm. And that's nothing new. I'm not spouting any new content. This is Clayton Christensen's Innovations, Dilemma, and Solution has been around quite a while now. So the biggest biases are thinking status quo and being risk averse to innovation. That's the biggest problem people can have. We also don't want to overreact. I just read an article today from HBR, which I agree with, is that sometimes executive teams get spooked by disruptive conversations with competitors, and they react without taking enough time to truly plan out what that roadmap is. So it's more of a reaction. They should be more proactive and plan it with the rollout instead of just immediately do something.
I find it so interesting too that and this is another paradox, is that business owners and the people who begin businesses, and even those who decide to step into leadership roles, they are inherently risk takers. And at some point they took the risk to invest in themselves to get into that big chair or to start a new business. And then the minute comfort takes over and steadiness takes over, they become very attached to that, and so risk averse. And I think it's a push-pull for leaders, and I've seen that, firsthand. A leader who is an agitator within their own environment, within their own company and ecosystem, is not always very well liked. And then it's hard sometimes. Then that runs up to how you motivate people and how you keep people engaged. It's a tricky balance there. So I have a lot of. I see it from both sides. I think it's really intriguing.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead, Justin.
I was just going to say, we try to practice compassion even with these leaders that we were pleading with them to opt in, and Emily and I have written and spoken at length about opt-inners, and really what you're talking about is opting into a new way of thinking about learning and what a consumer is. There's a tendency, I think, that it's some sort of character flaw, like these dinosaurs. We go into name calling and terms like that. Not that the three of us do that, but there's a tendency in the marketplace to do that, to basically move them to change with shame, Which the irony of that is that's how a lot of marketing and learning has been done, is through shame. Like, you don't know that, what's wrong with you? You don't have that product, what's wrong with you? So I think a level of compassion is really important to understand the pressures that these leaders are under to not just deal with this, but 1,000 things across the board.
Absolutely. I mean, it's harder. It's a very difficult place to be. And I completely agree. I don't think we do away with their thinking. We take that experience, we embrace their leadership. Mm-hmm. So in my ebook, I talk about two things. I say we embrace them and we educate them. Mm-hmm. And then hopefully with education comes a third alternative, a new way of thinking, while still working on the business model that's making the money. You still do that. Mm-hmm. Still move forward, but it wouldn't be, that's kind of it's like a backup. It's like saying, hey, not only are we being successful in this model, which we've proven over decades, but we're also putting our foot, not our toe, but we're putting our foot in the water, mm-hmm. maybe up to our knees, and we are really testing things out in some new and exciting ways. Mm-hmm. Putting our toe in the water only doesn't facilitate enough learning, in my opinion. It doesn't really give us enough feedback or enough information that we can really go by. We have to really test a market, or a product or a service in a new way with real clients, and then see how things work.
Mm-hmm. And get that, failure or lessons, that you said in the beginning is very essential. So I want to ask kind of a curveball question. So I take the conversation a different way. So one of the things that you write about in the ebook is this idea that people want to be a part of the learning, right? They want to be really connected. They want to be a part of the story. And I think that's so true. I mean, I see it, in a lot of different ways in the work that we do. People want to be connected to their brand at a deep level. And they want to have a sense of how their identity connects to the things that they do every day, and the way they spend a third of their life at work, and in a lot of other facets. And I know you're a parent as well, a parent of 5, right?
Yeah. And
you've authored several books on parenting.
Yes.
So how do you see this manifesting with your kids? There's a lot of talk. There's so much hand-wringing and worrying over how this generation of children, they want to be so connected. They are so connected digitally all the time to one another. And, how is this generation going to end up, this like fear-mongering around it. So I don't know, what's your take on that and that drive to be connected?
Yeah, the selfie generation, right? I find it amusing in a couple of ways that whenever when I travel, I like to go to a baseball field and go see a game, just because it's fun to be out with the people. And I find it's always fun to see and entertaining to see the younger generation taking lots of selfies instead of watching the game. And there's been some jokes about it on YouTube and stuff. But I also think it's funny that us older folks, we'll give someone our phone and say, take a selfie for us, right? We'll use silly terms like that, and it's not a selfie, someone's taking it. But yeah, everything we are learning is anecdotal. I think we misjudge based on our paradigms and our point of reference. We don't know yet what the impact's going to be. What we perceive is people with heads down in phones instead of socializing like we do. But they actually are socializing. They're actually connected far more than we ever were. Mm-hmm. The question is, how deep are those relationships? Mm-hmm. I have 3 teenage daughters. Mm-hmm. Yes, you can.
I only have 1, so hats off to you.
No, it's a imperative to me, actually. But what I've realized is they do have deep relationships with a handful of people, kind of like we did. They're just more connected with others. We do try as parents to restrict digital use, mm-hmm. because we don't know. When we're at home at a table, the rule is no phones. When we're together as a family, we just don't take out our phones. And that's been great to have that balance. I think they're learning the importance of the face-to-face as well. But it does impact learning and development. Relevance has always been a part of learning and development. If you can make that training relevant to someone and help them apply it, it's always been a better result. We know that. But even more so because of the conditioning. We want to not only apply it to ourselves and see how it's relevant, but we want to share it. Right? That's the cool thing about social media and professional media like LinkedIn. There are opportunities for us, if we like something and it becomes part of what we believe, we can share that. Mm-hmm. And so learning has taken on a new face because of those conditioning. And I really enjoy that, where that's going. It's becoming, we are more curators of information. There's no, I always say that the sage on the stage is no longer the expert. The community is the new expert.
Right.
Because there's this wealth of knowledge that the community brings, especially because people are sharing, maybe not their own content. Maybe they are sharing someone else's content. And sometimes they are contributing to that thought stream by adding their comments. Sometimes it is new content. But so all I'm saying is that that information and knowledge is constantly being curated and shared by this community that is just amazing at how learning can grow in that sphere.
Yeah, it seems like brands that really get this, I think of like Zappos is one that comes to mind. They seem to really get these changes that you're talking about, Treion, is that they have the perspective that the consumer of the information is not unlike the consumer of information in the marketplace, and that there is a heightened awareness that they have to do it a different way in order to be relevant and to create that efficacy that you're talking about. What I find curious is, I wonder when, I'll throw this out to both of you, but when will a dated L&D model start to affect recruiting and talent retention? When will it hurt enough from an ability where people want to go work at a Zappos or a place like that, or as opposed to work where they were being recruited because their L&D model is so dated? When is it going to start hurting, do you think?
It's already happened.
Okay.
I mean, people definitely, so there's always these rankings of best places to work.
Mm-hmm.
And I know in the past I've looked at those places and applied for jobs at the companies that were in those rankings, and that wasn't too long ago.
Mm-hmm.
I know the younger generation for sure want the benefits, want to feel like they are heard. And by the way, all of this is L&D. I know it's talent management, but it goes hand in hand, right? Mm-hmm. And they want to know, how can we grow within that company? What is the opportunities for development? And actually, there's some recent studies, and I don't know if it's the LinkedIn workplace study. I've just looked at so many of these recently, mm-hmm. or if it was the ATD annual report. Mm-hmm. But I think it was one of those two where it spoke about just what you're talking about, individuals that that personal development is a key indicator of someone going somewhere. Right. So how that is done, if it's old school and it doesn't do the job which I like it to do, like I do in my personal life, and this is very different, yeah, absolutely. I think it'll hurt retention rates, not only recruitment, but retention.
Right, exactly. Yeah. It's whenever and throughout history, and the Cold War is an example, is that the tyranny or the oppression of people caused the talent to leave. I mean, that's why there was a Berlin Wall, because the talent kept leaving, and yet
that's why there's the United States.
Yeah, exactly. And now you see that's still that same thing, that sort of preservation. This is the way we do things, and I think what's fascinating related to this too is you're talking about group. The group, or the community is the teacher. It's so much with the right systems and the right thinking. It's so much easier to access tribal knowledge. You remember the old training model of, well, here's the training stuff, and then you start your first day on the job, and the salty old person that's been there forever is like, well, here's how we really do things around here. Well, here's how we really do things around here is integrated in and fused into that tribal approach or community approach to learning. I think that's fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
I think it's interesting you brought up, the older generation, and I see a lot of people who are so excited to engage in learning in a new way. I think of my dad, who's 73 and retired, and still very much like a lifelong learner. And but technology, he's come along. But I love it when he'll ask a question, and maybe he'll be at our house, and my girls will turn to Alexa and they'll ask Alexa and get that answer, or they'll say, well, here, Papa, we can just Google it. And it comes up before him, or they'll show him a YouTube video, and there's this amazing, he's like, wow, this is so neat. So I think there's such a big market too out there for older people who are who are maybe later in years and maturity, and they are very specific about what they want to learn, but they get to learn it in this whole new way. And I wonder if there's anyone that's, you know, really kind of catering to that, or what do you see there? In any?
That's a great question. If anyone is specifically catering to the older generation with the Internet of Things, right?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I think, to your point though, the Internet of Things, like having my thermostat available when I'm on a trip, I can turn down the temperature or turn it up. It's my sprinkler system, my garage door, everything is connected. It's all interconnected. It makes life for especially older folks better, right? Mm-hmm. Think of them, falling down.
Right.
Not your dad necessarily, but someone that's older that falls down. In the past, they would be lying there, but now they can yell out, mm-hmm. Alexa, call my daughter or whatever. I don't think you can call 911 yet on those devices, by the way. But I think the Internet of Things is catering to it's ease of life, right? It's making things easier for everyone, but especially for the older generation, if they're willing to embrace it. And sometimes they're willing, they just don't know how.
Exactly. And that's, I think, the interesting gap there is that I think that the content is catered because we're like, oh, this is simple. Dad, it's so simple. Just, get on here. But when it's an interesting paradox too, my 14-year-old, she's the best IT person for him because she just will walk him through it step by step with a ton of patience. Once he does it, once he's got it down, he's off and running, but it takes a couple times maybe. And so it would be interesting to see somebody who could kind of take a step back and thoughtfully prepare something that would really minister someone along and then get them into that habit and routine.
Yeah, I think that goes to this idea that when we say they're really early, two types of people and audiences and employees and whatnot, and that's opt-iners and opt-outers, and mm-hmm. people sort of in between. But generally speaking, those are your two big blocks, and you see this in cultural divide. You see this in political differences, this divide between opting in and opting out. And what's interesting about the opting in, though, and this should be hopeful for companies, both from a traditional consumer standpoint, people you're marketing to, but also internal consumers like your employees and vendors, should be very hopeful that there really is only within the opt-in really a singular type of profile. They're curious, they're self-aware, they're all the things that like Bill Sikorski is at 73 and Mercedes Heatland is at 14. It's ageless, as opposed to the opt-outers, where I've seen this happen over and over again in L&D, where they're like, well, we have 5 generations of the workforce, 5 generations in our workforce. We need to divide the way that we train them. And I'm like, no, you don't. You just need to get everyone to opt in. And if everyone opts in, they all sort of learn the same way, tribally, as it were.
Here's the interesting thing. We have all opted in as consumers because it makes our lives easier, right? And yet we go to work and now we have to operate as a different person.
Yeah, that's a good point.
We have to because of the way things are structured. It's no longer easy to access information. I have to sign up for something or go to an hour-long training that may not provide me the answer I'm looking for. So this is the dilemma. This is the conundrum we have. And it's difficult. I'm not saying there's an easy answer to this, except with awareness, right? With knowledge comes power, and we can change that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So of all the paradoxes that we've talked about and all the kind of conflicting ideas, what's one that you would like to see kind of healed or the chasm sort of brought together? If you got to pick, you get to wave your magic wand very rapidly.
It is the topic we spoke about earlier, which is we can marry in the learning development space the successful models that have brought us here. We can continue doing that while at the same time innovating within our companies. Mm. It is that concept that there's always this hesitancy because of unknown, right? People, it's the unknown. So people will always bring up certain topics like, oh, it's going to cannibalize our business.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It doesn't. And if it does, it's such a small fraction, you'll never notice it because you're now catering to a completely different audience, right? There's some people that want to go to live training and some people that want digital training at their fingertips.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the biggest, thing people have to get over, is this concept of it's going to cannibalize.
Mm-hmm.
So I would really push hard for companies to look for ways to really innovate in the digital space, in the just-in-time space, and see how they can cater to what consumers want anyway. We want information now. We want it to be to the point and short. We want information to perform well. If something's digital, it has to look good. It has to perform well, or we're dumping it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it takes, 53% of people will wait a total of 3 seconds for a web page to load. If it takes longer than 3 seconds, we're out of there. That's 53% of people are waiting only 3 seconds.
Mm-hmm.
That's performance. That's also, if something doesn't look good, millennials will just delete apps if it doesn't look good. Like, oh, this is crap.
Mm-hmm.
This looks like, to them, 2010. And we go, wait, that's not that old. To them, it
is. Yeah, it's interesting. I think there is a direct line of sight, Treion, of what your message is about learning and consumers of content, and then our message to leaders about branding and marketing. That direct line of sight is it's no longer acceptable to be a 21st century brand to have your culture, which would include learning and development, out of alignment with the marketplace. That misalignment used to be fixed with marketing and advertising, with Marlboro Man, slick ad campaigns, and in the 20th century, that gap, that misalignment, was fixed internally by mandatory type, compulsory type situations. That's all over. If you're talented, you don't have to work there, and if you're a consumer, you got so many more choices. But when you fix it, when you create that alignment, where the human experience, as Emily and I call it, so we don't refer anymore to B2B or B2C or that. That's a relic. It's all H to H. It's all human to human. When you create that alignment, you get the holy grail of something. You get a differentiator. And so the argument I would have, anybody watching this, and it's like, well, what's the ROI for this? Well, the ROI is that you get to be a 21st century brand, as opposed to trying to prop up this gap that you have in the marketplace with advertising or internal propaganda.
And in your world, another term I've read about and read a lot about is CX, right? Consumer experience.
Yeah,
it's
right.
Consumer or customer-centric approach to everything you do. Every touch point you have with your client or your customer has to be spot on. It has to be what they want. See, the biggest mistake we make, whether it's in marketing companies, whether it's in learning development, is we get into a little room in our silos, and we determine what we think other people want based on our experiences. That is the biggest flaw we can make. We have to be listening more to our customers, our clients, our consumers. We have to know what do they really want, and what will they realistically consume. Realistically, not do what do we think or what are we going to force on them. The worst thing we can do is say, oh, we've been in this business for so long, we know it's this. And we dish up something and we miss the mark because we didn't listen to the customer. That's the biggest mistake we make. And most of the time, it's the consumer experience. It's just, what is the experience? Every touch point they have with us, have we identified what that is? And what type of experience are they having? And so, for me, the customers are the learners, right?
Mm-hmm.
What is the experience?
Yeah, I love that.
We work with that quite a bit, and people, and our definition of brand is how other people experience what you believe. And so we are very centric around how are you expressing those beliefs in each of your experiences, whether that is, a sales conversation or somebody, that point of purchase, or 6 months later. It's all part of the experience of your brand, and how you make people feel in those moments. And what you're able to provide, the value of it it's all connected. There's no more of this divide, all these divisions between, the way we think in work and the way we think at home and then what we want from our consumer experience. It's all together into one big melting pot.
True.
Yeah. Well, this has been an amazing conversation, if I do say so myself.
Time flies.
Yeah.
But alas, it ends. So I would ask this, Treion, is there anything that, well, I'll put it this way. we'll quote Seinfeld and Festivus, an airing of grievances. Is there anything you want to get off your chest that we didn't get to in the Q&A that we did with you today?
No, I think I've been pretty vocal in my grievances.
Yeah. You've had gentle grievances.
I think there's a lot of good going on. Don't get me wrong.
Yeah, we see that too. Mm-hmm. So if people want to follow you and learn your ideas, what's the best way to do that? What's the best medium to follow you on as you continue to promote your ideas in the world?
LinkedIn is probably the best. So you can either connect or follow on LinkedIn. I'll share this podcast or this webcast on LinkedIn, as well as my ebook. It will be free. So I'm providing that on LinkedIn, link to the channels that you can access it.
Great.
So that's probably the best way.
Okay, good. Very good.
Wonderful. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. And thanks to everybody who tuned in live. We were streaming live as well. So we will have a recording and we'll post that. Treion will post that, as well as we'll post it on Root and River and on both of our personal social media accounts. So you can visit back to it, as well as on our website, which is rootandriver.com.
Awesome. Thank you for the awesome conversation.
Thanks, guys. Have a good day.
You too.